Turn with me to Luke in chapter 22. Luke in chapter 22. We're going to try to finish this chapter up tonight. We're going to begin in verse 54 and go through verse 71, which would end the chapter. As we talked about last week, Judas's betrayal of Jesus, and of course Jesus' prediction of Peter's denial. Ultimately, Judas betrayed Jesus there in the garden with a kiss. And we know at that very point that the disciples had already discovered that they had two swords, and Jesus says it is enough. And I shared with you last week how that he was making that statement that that's enough of that. That's enough of that. But we see upon the very time frame, or the very night that Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, that one of the disciples did take up the sword and cut off one of the servant's ears. And Jesus chose at that time, he chose to perform another miracle there, even to those people who came to arrest him and those who would be witnesses to his arrest. And so we see Jesus being led into the city. Now, Luke doesn't record but only two trials. But we find from some of the other Gospels that Jesus was actually tried three different times. Two of the times that Jesus was tried, he was tried at night, which was against the rules. It was against Jewish tradition and against Jewish law. According to Jewish law, trials had to take place. They had to take place during the daylight hours. And the order in which the trial would proceed would be is that all of the evidence, first all of the evidence of innocence would be produced. And it's been said that all of the evidence of innocence would be produced so that there would be a room, if you will, or a stigma of mercy. There would be the opportunity for mercy. And then later on, after the evidence of innocence was presented, then the evidence of guilt would be presented. And we know that the Jewish law required 2 or 3 witnesses. And my understanding is that each one of these witnesses had to be interrogated individually. They could not have any contact with one another, and they had to be interrogated individually, and so that all of their stories would line up. But we know that when Jesus was arrested, as we continue to read the story of his trial, we see where the witnesses that were brought before, even their stories didn't sync, they didn't match up. And so that being the case, according to Jewish law, the trial of Jesus would have been thrown out. Now, the reason the third trial took place, we know that Jesus had already been convicted in the minds of those who were trying him. But the reason the third trial took place is so that all of the Sanhedrin could gather together. I believe it's John records that the first trial took place on the night of his arrest at the house of Annas. Annas was an ex-chief priest. He was, my understanding, the father-in-law to Caiaphas. According to Luke, Jesus would then be taken to Caiaphas' house for a nightly trial. Therefore, it would be the next morning before the Sanhedrin would gather together. But in their own minds, they'd already made their decision. Now, and I've already jumped way ahead of myself, but in Luke in chapter 22, let's begin reading in verse 54 concerning Peter's betrayal. Then took they him and led him and brought him into the high priest's house, and Peter followed afar off. And when they'd kindled a fire in the midst of the hall and were set down together, Peter sat down among them. But a certain maid beheld him as he sat by the fire and earnestly looked upon him and said, "This man was also with him," and he denied him, saying, "Woman, I know him not." And after a little while another saw him and said, "Thou art also of them." And Peter said, "Man, I am not." And about the space of 1 hour after another confidently affirmed, saying, "Of a truth, this fellow also was with him, for he is a Galilean." And Peter said, "Man, I know not what thou sayest." And immediately while he yet spake, the cock crew. And the Lord turned and looked upon Peter, and Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said unto him, "Before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice." And Peter went out and wept bitterly. Now, Peter sometimes gets a bad rap. We know that because of Peter was very short-tempered. We know that from all of the encounters that we read about concerning Peter. we know that Peter was the one who drew the sword in the garden and cut off the servant's ear. We know that Peter had already proclaimed to the Lord, I will go with you to the point of death. And that's when Jesus had given the prophecy, or had prophesied that Peter would deny him before the rooster crowed 3 times. But you got to give Peter a little bit of credit. We talk about oftentimes Peter walking on the water. We taught our children in Sunday school and in Vacation Bible School about Peter stepping out of the boat into the water in the midst of the storm. When he says to the Lord, Lord, if it be thee, bid me come to thee. Bid me, in other words, call me to you, draw me to you. And so Peter steps out of the boat. But then we know as Peter began seeing the waves crashing at his feet, he began to sink. But he cries out these 3 words in that story, Lord, save me. And Jesus reaches and grabs him by the hand. Immediately they're in the boat. But Peter was willing to step out of the boat. Here we see when the very night that Jesus was arrested, all of the disciples scattered. They all scattered, with the exception of Peter. You got to give Peter a little bit of credit. Even though he followed from a distance, he at least followed him. He continued on the path that his master would take. But when it came time, what boiled down to a nutshell, when it came time that he could openly profess Christ, in fact, he would fulfill what Jesus had already prophesied to him. 3 different occasions he would deny him. One of the other Gospels tells us that Peter was recognized because of his dialect, or his tongue, his language. He spoke with a Galilean dialect, kind of like y'all used to make fun of me because I speak South Arkansas. But Peter had this distinctive tone in his voice, this distinctive dialect, so that he was recognized immediately as a Galilean. So the first thing one of the things that Peter denies, he denies that he's even from Galilee. He says, man, I don't even know what you're talking about. One of the accusations against Peter was from the young servant girl. The King James Version lists her as a certain maid. And she immediately identifies Peter as being with Jesus. And he rejects that idea altogether. He tells her, I don't know him. The King James Version says, I know him not. The second accusation comes when another man looks and says, thou art also of them. Him being recognized as being a follower and disciple of Christ. Peter says, man, I am not. I am not. Immediately when Peter hears the rooster crow, obviously, as we know, Luke is getting this second-hand account, but he records the Lord looking at Peter. No doubt Peter had gone over Jesus' prophecy at the very moment that rooster crowed. He remembered. And when the Lord cut his eyes at him, how shameful that would be. Some have said that Peter, and if you remember, Jesus had told Peter that Satan has desired, or King James English, Satan hath desired to sift you as a grain of wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith fail not. Many would point out to the denials of Peter and say, well, you know what? Peter's faith failed. But we look at the very next instance, and what was Peter's response when he looked at Jesus and Jesus was looking at him following the rooster crowing? It says that Peter went out, in verse 62, and wept bitterly. One writer put that it was appropriate for him to weep bitterly at that moment, but Peter was not without hope. As much as Jesus' promise that Peter would deny him was true, so was the promise that your faith should not fail. That comes from Luke in chapter 22 and verse 32 that we read last week. Peter fell, he says, but had not fallen away. Charles Haddon Spurgeon, I was reading his study notes this afternoon as I was finishing preparation for tonight. He said this, he said, "It is a blessed thing that of the work of grace in the soul when the man who has sinned quits his evil companions and mourns over his sin as one who is in bitterness for his firstborn." So many have taken that passage in verse 62, where it says that Peter wept bitterly. He wasn't just crying, he wasn't just weeping, but he was weeping bitterly. He was weeping the tears of remorse and regret. Now, a lot of people become sorrowful for their sins, but that's primarily when they get caught. And we could say, well, you know what? Peter got caught with his hand in the mousetrap. But I point to you what verse 61 says in the second half of that verse. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord. Peter remembered the word of the Lord. Now we know the history of Peter, and Peter would be one of the staunch foundational cornerstones of the church in Jerusalem. The hot-headedness would not leave him. We know that later on that there would be some bickering between Peter and one of the other apostles regarding circumcision, for instance. Peter had allowed his old Jewish heritage and his Jewish traditions to intercede and to overcome the gospel message that salvation comes by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. And Peter, at that point, he would take 2 steps back, and from that point forward, I believe that Peter began to preach the gospel of grace and of mercy and of God's love for mankind. And so we begin reading in verse 63. It says, "And the men that held Jesus mocked him and smote him, and when they had blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, Prophesy, who is it that smote thee? And many other things blasphemously spake they against him." One of the other Gospels records also that they spat in his face. In this instance, Jesus fulfills the prophecy, I believe, or at least a part of the prophecy of Isaiah, where it says, "And he was led as a lamb to slaughter, yet opened not he his mouth." He didn't open his mouth. We know because of his divine character that he obviously, even though he was blindfolded, he could have immediately called the name of those who had struck him. He could have called the name of those who had spat in his face. He could have called the name of those who had blasphemed him in so many other ways. But he chose not to. He chose not to. Showing the very humble and obedient spirit which he took on himself to become the sacrifice for the sins of men. I mentioned in the very introduction how Luke doesn't record the proceedings of the first trial, the first nighttime trial, before the high priest of Annas, which you can find that recorded in Matthew in chapter 26. And we assume that these beatings and these mockeries that they made of him at this time happened following that first trial before the former high priest Annas. At least following the trial with Caiaphas. We find in verse 66 where Jesus comes and stands before the Sanhedrin, or his second trial. Let me back up for just a moment. Let me quote Charles Haddon Spurgeon once again. He said, I must also call him victorious. His persecutors could not make him give way to anger. They could not destroy his mercy, nor they could not slay his love. They could not cause him to think of himself. They could not make him declare he would go no further with his work of saving sinners now that men began to scoff at him and smite him and despitefully use him. In verse 66, and as soon as it was day, now we know that this was after the second trial. And as soon as it was day, the elders of the people and the chief priests and the scribes came together and led him into their council, saying, now this was the Sanhedrin. This was the Sanhedrin. As soon as the day broke, the Sanhedrin gathered together, and at this time, this would conform with Jewish law in that it would be an official session of those who would place themselves as judge over the Lord. And we're going to see in just a moment that Jesus is going to say hereafter, in verse 69, shall the Son of Man sit on the right hand of the power of God. In other words, he says, hereafter, I'm going to be the judge. But at the time that the Sanhedrin had come together and they led him into their council, they say in verse 67, and art thou the Christ? Tell us. And he said unto them, if I tell you, ye will not believe. He had already gone before Annas. He had already gone before Caiaphas. He had been preaching in the temple before the Sanhedrin, or before the priests of the temple, the Pharisees and the scribes, on many different occasions. And by the time they ask this question, they have already settled in their mind, because they've already sought attempts. They've already sought an attempt to draw Jesus away from the people that they might kill him. They wanted the opportunity. But they had to make it official. And so as they gather together, they ask him the question, are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah? Are you the one that the prophecy of Old Testament has foretold of? And Jesus' response lets us understand that they've already, in their mind, they've already made their decision. He says, if I tell you, you won't believe it. Remember the witnesses that had been brought? How their stories didn't match up and they didn't mesh? That in itself, according to Jewish law, would have been enough to throw out the case against Jesus. But they already had it settled in their mind. They hated Jesus enough that in essence they had already nailed him to the cross in their hearts. They'd already had him killed. In verse 68, Jesus continues the conversation with them. He says, and if I also ask you, ye will not answer me, nor let me go. In other words, if I ask you, am I the Christ? You'll not answer either. You see, they'd been blinded by their sin. No doubt, as we read the Gospels and we read the story of the ministry of Jesus, there were many who had proposed that Jesus was a prophet or a great man. As a matter of fact, when Jesus asked his own disciples, who do men say that I am? Remember what their response was? Some say that you're Elijah. Some say that you're another prophet. Some say that you're John the Baptist. By this time, John had already been beheaded. He'd already been killed by Herod. Many have proposed in the next chapter, we're going to see where Herod he wants to see Jesus, perhaps so Jesus can perform another miracle in front of him, but we can't help but believe that Herod must have been a little bit hesitant if he had heard the stories that John the Baptist had been raised from the dead. Now we know that Jesus and John's ministries had overlapped, so we know that obviously Herod, in logical thinking, would have known that Jesus was not John the Baptist, but nonetheless he wanted to see him. He wanted to put his eyes on him. In verse 69, Jesus says, "Hereafter shall the Son of Man sit on the right hand of the power of God. Then said they all, Art thou then the Son of God?" They'd already asked him, "Are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah?" They wanted to hear from Jesus directly if he claimed to be the Messiah. And now here it is, they've put on a show, they've already made up their minds what the conclusion is going to be from the trial that has yet to take place officially. And when Jesus announces to them that you judge me tonight, but I'll be the judge of you later on. He refers to himself as the Son of Man, which Jesus often did. One of the Gospels in particularly refers to Jesus quite often, or he refers to himself as the Son of Man. Now, I'm not going to tell you which Gospel, you'll have to read all four. But to answer their question, it tells us, "And he said unto them, Ye say that I am." I like the terminology that many government officials and administration often use today. The Pentagon today would neither confirm nor deny. Or the president would neither confirm nor deny. Or the press secretary would neither confirm nor deny. Jesus neither confirmed nor denied, but he simply said this, "You say that I am." That ends with the period in the King James English, in the King James Version of the Bible. But many were proposing that Jesus, in fact, was asking a question. Do you say that I am? He had already pronounced himself as the Son of Man, sitting on the right hand of the power of God. And their question was, are you the Son of God? And if some commentators are right and Jesus proposed a question to them, then he gave them one more opportunity to proclaim him as the Son of God. But they had become so blinded by their sin and so hard-hearted. It tells us in verse 71, "And they said, What need we any further witness? For we ourselves have heard of his own mouth." What had they heard? What had they heard? They'd heard the false witnesses the night before. They'd already accused Jesus of being a blasphemer. If you remember, there were some who had proclaimed Jesus was a great man of God. But when it came time for the trial, and we look at the men who begged Pilate for the body of Jesus. Who were they? Anybody remember? All right, there's some homework for next week. One of them was a part of the Sanhedrin. I'm not going to tell you which one. That's part of the homework. But at the very time of the trial, all in favor say aye. Aye. We know it wasn't a Baptist business meeting because they were all in agreement. And so they say their witnesses ultimately would have avoided all of the guilt that they tried to lay on Jesus. But they themselves make the statement, why do we need any witnesses? That statement in itself would be against Jewish law for the conviction of an accused. They say, for we ourselves have heard of his own mouth. Do you think that Jesus could have ever received a fair trial if it in fact were the Sanhedrin themselves who were testifying to the eyewitness accounts of what they had seen and were also serving as the judge over the court case or over the case? The prosecution? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. At this point of this daytime trial, they simply made no effort to find any testimony against Jesus. The nighttime witnesses hadn't worked out, and so they avoided witnesses altogether. Let that stew, let that simmer.